Yes.
I'm going to make 2 points in relation to hepatitis N A and B, as it then was. We've addressed this at some length in our written submissions, and I'm not going to say more than that about this issue now. On Tuesday, Mr. Snowdon took you to Dr. Walford's 1980 memo, where she captured the point and her recently acquired knowledge that 90% of post-transfusion hepatitis was of the NA-NB variety, and that it could be rapidly fatal. And so you'll recall her evidence that she escalated a communication of that knowledge up the chain and sent her memo around the department quite widely and to her superiors. So I won't take you back to that. What I would ask us to do just very briefly is then fast forward about 7 years to Dr. Smithy's memo of the 17th of February 1987, and that's DHSC 301383. This is a 3-page document, and this is the last page. And it's worth looking at in a little bit of detail. I think we've looked at the first paragraph more than once, but the second paragraph is of interest as well. She talks about the finite number of haemophiliacs who've contracted HIV infection, and remember this is February 1987, so significant numbers of people are already in the haemophilia community dying of AIDS at this point in the UK. And their position being pitiful and having attracted great sympathy, in part because of the perceived stigma. It wasn't just perceived, it was objectively as well as subjectively present. And then she says, the equally sad fact that a number of haemophiliacs will undoubtedly die of chronic hepatitis as a result of non-A, non-B infection has not been recognised publicly, which suggests that it's been well known within the department privately, but somehow not recognised publicly. So that's of concern. And then a passing interest, she says, she draws a parallel with non-steroidal anti-inflammatory drugs and some patients being relieved of pain by using those over-the-counter drugs. And she says, I find it difficult to advocate that there are any special circumstances surrounding the care of haemophilia which makes their case for compensation greater than that of other patients who take medicines which kill them. That is, of course, provided the doctors caring for the patients have prescribed their treatment in a proper manner. A few points arise. Number one, the last sentence is a bit of a big if when it comes to infected blood. The second is it's a false equivalence between anti-inflammatory drugs, which one can choose a variety of painkillers and buy over the counter, and infected blood. It smacks of whataboutery. There are so many differences, it shouldn't be necessary to spell them out. AIDS at this time had a very high mortality rate. Drugs that you can buy over the counter and take for arthritis, if you choose to do so, really didn't. And it's a paragraph that seems lacking in compassion and lacking, in a sense, the reality of people's lives in February 1987.
I mean, an example of a non-steroidal anti-inflammatory drug is something like ibuprofen. And to suggest that you're saying, I think, are you, that somebody who takes ibuprofen suffers stigma, for instance, anything equivalent is not appropriate?
Not very.
No. Thank you.
If we keep that in mind, can take it off the screen. Thank you, Lawrence. If one goes forward 8 months or so to the 3rd of November 1987, that was the date when the then Minister in the department, Mr. John Moore, had the memorable meeting with the Society, and DHSC, in its written submissions, has reproduced some of the evidence in that regard. A memorable meeting with the Society at which he was reduced to tears because attending this meeting were 3 young men who were infected with HIV/AIDS, who explained to him their fears for themselves and their families. And Mr. Roger Moore, the civil servant, explained that he'd never seen somebody cry in a meeting before. The Society would suggest that in a properly run health system that was not disjointed and siloed, the Minister, Mr. Moore, would have been told in preparation for this meeting that infected blood had given people with haemophilia not just AIDS, but also hepatitis NA and B, which could also be fatal, and from which a number of them, in Dr. Smithy's words earlier that year, were undoubtedly going to die. Given Mr. John Moore's reaction to what he heard in the meeting, it is reasonable to think that he would have acted on information about that second killer virus had he been told about it, as one might think he should have been. The second point, if we fast forward almost a decade, to the World in Action programmes, which are a valuable resource, broadcast in October 1996, with Lord Horam, that's HSOC 0008602. The interviews with him are interesting on a number of accounts, not least he gives the line, oft repeated by politicians since, well, we don't want to spend money on compensation, it would be much better if we used that money for the wider community, at the same time refusing to fund recombinant. So not using the money saved by not paying compensation for the benefit of the wider community. But he's also asked about hepatitis C, as it was then called. And it was put to him in October 1996 by the programme that £26 million had been spent on research on AIDS and just £1 million on researching, quote, this is what's put to him, the hepatitis epidemic, which scientists believe could affect more than 10 times as many. And Lord Horam's response to that was, quote, we are not talking about those sort of numbers. And by that he meant the number of people who were going to be infected with hepatitis C, not the amount of money. One might think that if the facts that Dr. Smithies was aware of and that were known within the department in 1987 had been recognised publicly at that time, there ought to have been a less dismissive response by the Minister in 1996, and there would not have been a decade of lost opportunity for properly funded research, learning and improved patient care. In our written submissions, we've set out a lot of the activity that the Society was engaged on in around hepatitis C in the 1990s and the campaign that was started and where that led to eventually after a lot of hard pushing. So I'm going to deal briefly with some miscellaneous matters, and they are litigation, hepatitis C, and the tone that the Society has adopted from time to time over the years. The Society is aware that there is some dismay about the position it took in relation to litigation over HIV infections and its communication to government of its stance. The documents indicated that when it first asked the government for financial help for people with haemophilia infected with AIDS, the government's response was that it only pays compensation where there is fault, and it therefore invited infected people with haemophilia to sue. That's there in a document, HSOC 0003459, and I'll come on later in these submissions to talk about the government's response to people who have been affected by some of the Cumberledge medicines and devices, particularly those affected by mesh and sodium valproate, which has been exactly the same. That might be good evidence, you might think, that that was the government's response in the 1980s, since that remains the government's response in the 2020s. Litigation was only open to those who had legal aid or enough money to pay lawyers, and that left many people with haemophilia in the middle. They didn't have insufficient money to qualify for legal aid, and they didn't have enough money to pay privately for representation, so they couldn't bring a claim. The Society was painfully aware that people were dying, and it didn't want to use what little energy and time they had left on legal proceedings, so the Society's aim was to get something for everyone infected as quickly as possible. To do that, it pursued a campaign, and later ones, on moral, not legal grounds. And that was an unusual tactic driven by necessity. The Society had advice from a barrister that any claim it brought on behalf of the charity was unlikely to succeed. And in addition, money was needed within the timescales of the dying, not within the timescales of litigation. That would take years, which people didn't have. Convincing government to take this unusual moral case seriously required an explanation of both reasons as to why litigation was not an option. After the McFarlane £10 million had been secured, the Society pressed on with a second campaign for the same reason that infected people needed money urgently. And the Society notes the witness statement of Lord Frank Field, who wrote to you of his own volition, in which he described his work with David Waters to get adequate compensation for infected haemophiliacs so they didn't have to start court action, and the media campaign they collaborated on with the Sunday Times. In November 1989, the government offered a further £24 million, including payments of £20,000 each to each person infected or their family of those who had died. There was pressure exerted by MPs acting on behalf of the government at an all-party meeting on the 30th of November 1989 to compel acceptance of that offer. And Lord Field recalls in his statement being, quote, knocked over by the violence of the language used, unquote. At that point, over 100 people had died of infected blood products, and the litigation wasn't scheduled to start until 1991, by which time many more would have died. After the award of the ex gratia payment, the number of claimants into the litigation increased because many people used all or some of their £20,000 payment to fund joining the litigation. So the Society launched another media offensive for out-of-court compensation, and it did so despite Dr. Kernoff, who was sitting on its medical advisory panel, advising the Society against becoming involved on the grounds that, quote, people might start suggesting that people with haemophilia are too greedy. The reference for that is HSOC 0010954. As you know, settlement of the court action was reached after Mr. Justice Ognall's intervention in June 1990, where he repeatedly referred to a moral duty. Much later, in June 2018, I think that must be 2008, Mr. Graham Ross, the solicitor who acted for many of the claimants, appeared before the Archer inquiry, and he explained how the settlement had been achieved at some length. In his evidence, he appeared appreciative of the Society's efforts to assist the litigation, and the Society notes the statement of Sir Rupert Jackson, who was then junior counsel for the claimants in the litigation. He says that the case was very worrying, that plaintiffs were dying every month, that by the time of the settlement 148 patients had died, and the case, quote, faced significant difficulties on liability and causation, unquote. He described the central defendants as intransigent, and said in his view, quote, "It is unfortunate that the government of the day did not face up to its moral responsibility in the same way that the present government has." At which point, after yesterday, we might say, up to a point, Lord Copper. Turning to hepatitis C, the Society is painfully aware that there are a number of infected and affected people who feel that it did too little too late, and it wasn't there for the community at a time of need. The Society has done its best to respond to those concerns in two very lengthy witness statements made by its current Chief Executive, Kate Burt. I think only one of them has just been made available. As she says in those statements, the Society hears you, deeply regrets that you feel let down, and would welcome the opportunity to listen to those who feel harmed. The mid-90s were a time of crisis for the charity. Those running it were exhausted by campaigning, and the organisation was on the brink of bankruptcy. Some of the trustees felt that the Society wasn't representing them, and they'd achieved more from the outside than they could from the inside, and they set up their own campaigns. The documents referred to by Ms. Burt show that there was a considerable amount of working together, but there's no doubt that these splits were painful and sad. Everybody wanted the same thing, but it may be that the combined effect of different tactics taken by different campaigners was greater than one single campaign would have been. The Society felt it had a responsibility to the whole of the bleeding disorder community, and one can see that in its attempts to meet everyone's needs, thereby perhaps pleasing nobody and dissatisfying a cross-section of the membership. If we look briefly at a page from the 1998 bulletin, WITN 6392059 at page 10. Squidgy print, which I hope you can read. This is a letters page. Lawrence, I don't know if you can just put the whole page on so that people can see what it there. It looks like that. And it's printing 3 letters which are a response to the chair of the Hampshire group. If we look at the top left, this is from Stan Coburn, the chair of the Manor House group. And the writer of the article that these letters are responding to is Mary Clark. And he says, she's concerned that the Society will divide into different groups. I must ask, is she living in the clouds? The Society is already split into several groups. We have haemophiliacs who've received a very derisory payment for being infected with HIV. We have young people who will be receiving recombinant products now coming online as they should. What have the people of my own generation been given? Absolutely nothing. And in the last paragraph of that letter, the editorial stated that the HCV campaign has highlighted the need for better treatment for hepatitis patients. This lesson should have been learned from the HIV campaign and not as an afterthought. The editor's reply is, we need to help everyone with haemophilia. All those I speak to agree that we must continue the HCV campaign, and we shall. However, I would like to see all of us helping each other and not just following our own particular needs. I think you can see how that is both a reasonable response and, for those with particular needs and infections, an unreasonable one. It's the Society trying to please all of the people all of the time and failing to do so. Then we've got another letter. If we look at the bottom of the left-hand column, wake up, Mrs. Clark. The haemophilia community has been divided ever since some people received viral infections through their contaminated treatment. We shall continue to be divided until we can secure safe treatment for all, and until there is some recognition by the government that they have a moral obligation to us. And then at the end of this letter, there have been far too many mistakes made at the expense of haemophiliacs, and we need to shout about it. And I'll say some more about the Society's campaigning tone in a moment. And lastly, you get a letter from a different perspective, I've been married for 30 years to a man with haemophilia. He's now 63, and one of the few haemophiliacs who didn't contract HIV. He's now been told he's hepatitis C positive. I feel this letter from Mary Clark points to the fact that people like him have been forgotten. We feel guilty that he only suffers so far from bleeds. And in the last paragraph, there must be many other haemophiliacs like who feel they cannot approach the society because they only have haemophilia. Thank you, Lawrence.
Just one moment. I wonder if we can redact the name there. Thank you.
The fact that people felt they had to leave the society remains a source of great regret to the charity now. This hurt, and everyone involved in these splits was hurt, were a consequence of government forcing physically injured and psychologically damaged and bereaved people to fight for justice and compensation. And it is partly these experiences in the 1990s that caused the society to now advocate strongly for a system based on swift and fair redress for NHS patients who suffer avoidable harm from a system's breakdown. Lastly, something about saying it right. The society recognises that there are some people who feel that it hasn't been vocal or hard-hitting enough in speaking truth to power, and has in summary been too deferential. Its focus on achieving the greatest good for the greatest possible number has caused it to take a pragmatic approach and to be an organisation, so far as it could, that government could do business with when it was possible to do business. The brief account of the campaigning work that the Society did between 1987 and 91 to obtain some financial redress for all people with haemophilia infected with HIV as soon as possible illustrates, we submit, how tenacious the Society was and how it didn't bow to pressure but kept on campaigning for more after the £20,000 lump sums were paid. And it was capable of hard-hitting tactics at times. For example, when campaigning for the out-of-court settlement in 1990, it ran an ad campaign. We've not been able to find a picture of this, but there is a description of it in the letter of complaint that was written about the ad campaign to, I think, the BMJ. And this is a new document that's been given the number HSOC 0029910. It had a picture of a child, and the caption read, "Heredity gave him haemophilia, then the NHS gave him AIDS." So there was a complaint about that, and I think, trying to piece it out, the essence of the complaint was that ad campaign ran in 1990, and people looking at it might think that the NHS was giving children AIDS in 1990 rather than in the 1980s. In any event, Dr. Bird wrote a letter of complaint with, it seems, the knowledge of some members of the civil service, and a complaint was made and upheld to the Advertising Standards Board. All of that said, generally, the Society has had most campaigning success when appealing to the government's moral, not legal duty. And the Carpet of Lilies campaign, which witnesses have said they found moving, relied on personal accounts of the damage done to individual lives when government loses sight of its moral obligation to keep a section of the public safe. And that was a powerful campaign. There is some evidence that a quiet explanation of a situation can be more effective than a loud one. Mr. Roger Moore told the inquiry on the 18th of January last year that when the Society delegation, which included the 3 young men with haemophilia infected with HIV, came to ask the Minister for money, and that was a meeting that the Minister went into, firmly decided that no money would be forthcoming. The public servants were expecting anger in a difficult meeting, and Mr. Roger Moore said, and quote, "And what struck us actually was that these were people who had a right to be angry, and they weren't. They They were only concerned about the families that they'd leave behind. And we listened, and we were really moved. The trusts and schemes were never adequate, fair or dignified, but they were the best that the society could achieve in the face of government refusal to compensate people for their injuries. And the society's efforts on behalf of the whole community meant that many people who would not otherwise have done so did at least get something in their lifetime, even though it was not enough. That brings me to the present and to an apology. In 2017, the Society issued an apology as follows: that its statements during the 1980s, reassuring patients that new factor treatments were safe and to continue using them. We also lobbied the government to continue allowing the import of products from the USA. The advice we gave our members was based on guidance from the Haemophilia Centre directors, now known as the UKHCDO, and from the government. The leadership and trustees of the Haemophilia Society were misled and as a result unwittingly further contributed to the scandal. However, we accept that our actions and statements at the time, while well-intentioned and based on expert advice, have subsequently been shown to be damaging to the community and false. For this we unreservedly apologise. The submissions of some other infected and affected core participants make it clear that some people feel that does not go far enough. Now, there's a risk that the Society will sound like the DHSC, and I hope you won't take what I'm now going to say in that same way. The point of the inquiry for the Society is multiple, but one of the points is to listen to Sir Brian's objective and fully informed judgment, and that will be an important part of the learning it does about itself in the past and now. The Society thinks that it makes sense to reflect on his findings before it says any more than it said in 2017. You'll then have the benefit of something that is considered and not the Society marking its own homework, but listening to a proper examiner and a thoughtful dissection of what it got right and what it got wrong. The Society said this in its written submissions, that it would like to say to the inquiry and to each person infected and affected by contaminated blood that it was not separate to its members. It was its members. It was run by patients, for patients. Those who formed the executive committee were individuals who shared with the members they served the same group of doctors and such information, advice, choices and treatments as were made available to them all. They suffered or watched the children they loved suffer the same appalling treatment-induced illnesses and deaths. And the Society doesn't seek not to be judged. It does seek to be judged in this light. Throughout the inquiry, the Society and its trustees and staff, many of whom are here today, have made it their mission to listen and build bridges while remaining sensitive to those who need distance from it. That any member of the bleeding disorder community should need such distance remains a source of profound sadness to the Society, and it hopes to be able to rebuild trust and work together in the future. The Society would encourage anyone who's not had the opportunity to do so to look at Kate Burt's statements and those add to the statements made by others who've provided evidence to the Society. And on behalf of everyone at the charity, Clive Smith, who you know and who's here, and Kate Burt, who you may not know, but who is also here, please do go and say hello. Kate, perhaps you'd like to put your hand in the air. We hear you, and we invite you and hope you will feel able to talk to us or continue to talk to us. The Society hopes that this period of time between now and the report's publication and the setting up of the compensation framework and the legal and psychological support structures that need to accompany it could be a time of healing. It would like to pay tribute to the infected blood campaigners who've given such a large part of their lives up to the fight for justice. These include the Manor House Group, the Birchgrove Group, Tainted Blood, the Contaminated Blood Campaign, Positive Women, Haemophilia Action UK, Haemophilia Scotland, Haemophilia Wales, the Scottish Infected Blood Forum, Haemophilia Northern Ireland, Friends and Families of Haemophilia Northern Ireland, the Fatherless Generation and Factor 8, alongside many other groups and charities and individuals without whom we would never have seen this inquiry take place. We particularly remember those campaigners who did not live to see the end of the inquiry. Thank you. And turn lastly to the future and to recommendations. We've covered these extensively in written submissions, and I've got written down on paper in front of me a number of lists. I will summarise things as briefly as I can, but our submissions were supported by the results of a survey of the membership and their priorities and needs. One of the things that those responding to the Society survey were clear about, and I think this is something that everybody here will share, is the fact that they were very clear that annual payments must continue. The Society was pleased to see that Sir Robert's report is called Compensation and Redress for the Victims of Infected Blood. It agrees with Mr. Snowden that language is important. Use of words such as hardship and recompense and so on have led to confusion about the purpose of the monies made available, restrictions on payments out, and the widespread feeling among applicants that they've had to beg for scraps. It's appropriate for the new financial payments, which will be made as a result of this inquiry, to be called what they are: compensation. The Society repeats what it's called for in submission to any compensation scheme that's established, and here comes the list. Anyone who's been significantly affected having the right to make a claim, to continue existing support schemes alongside a compensation scheme, compensation to be sufficiently personalised to ensure it reflects the loss and damage suffered by an individual, with a framework that should include set tariffs to allow a faster but robust system for those who want to take that route, a fast track to an emergency payment for those in urgent need, an upfront lump sum to be paid to the infected and affected community in advance of the full amount, a clear, straightforward process which is easy to use, specialist support for people making applications, particularly where evidence has been lost or destroyed. The claims should be approved on a balance of probabilities, with the starting point being that the evidence of the applicant is believed. Total parity across devolved nations. A compensation package funded by the Westminster government, because this scandal happened before devolution. A system which allows transfer of information from support administrators to schemes to reduce the burden on claimants to provide information. A transparent appeals system. Previous payments not to be taken into consideration, inclusion of non-financial elements in the compensation package such as psychological support, health passporting and government underwritten life insurance, financial advice available to all receiving compensation, an individual assessment by a judge-led panel with representation from the community, if people choose that route, and to widen eligibility to include impact from viruses or exposure outside the current support schemes, such as hepatitis B and VCJD. Accessibility. A significant number of eligible Society members are older, they don't have smartphones, they don't have tablets or computers, they prefer to get information on paper in the post, and they are traumatised by their infections. They've had to fill these forms out time and again, and they can't face the idea that they'll have to do it once more. They don't want to have to handle any more administrative tasks themselves. They need help. The inquiry has heard a substantial body of evidence about the hurt caused by the administration of the schemes. The future arrangements must be characterised by respect and compassion. The Society supports the submission by the UKHCDO at paragraph 262 of its closing submissions about compensation for those who've cleared infection with hepatitis C spontaneously. Psychological support. The publication of the inquiry's report will be the start of a new chapter and the risk that vulnerable individuals will be left to cope alone again. That mustn't be allowed to happen. It is unfortunate that the start of the new framework will come at a time when the country's finances are in poor shape and public sector workers are on strike. The Society hopes that the inquiry will make it clear that one of the lessons to be learned from the contaminated blood scandal is that denial of injustice and postponement of financial responsibility while generations suffer is a false economy. Late compensation costs more than timely and adequate redress when people are ill and dying and carers and dependents are most in need of the money. And the Society hopes, Sir Brian, that you might be able to get across the very simple message, delay doesn't pay. Non-financial recommendations. In common with many of the other call participants, the Society made recommendations on public inquiry reform, redress for avoidable harm, consent, continuing scrutiny of recommendation implementation, the Irish experience, access to current treatment and up-to-date information, ongoing longer-term assistance, research on future care and palliative care, training and education, education about the scandal itself, and an apology and a memorial. We repeat all of those, and today we wish to say a little more about treatment and information for the bleeding disorder community and something about public inquiry reform, redress, consent and candour. Before turning to those areas, a word about follow-up and delivery. At the beginning of these submissions, I spoke about the need for a formal framework to ensure that the government's feet are held to the fire. The Patient Safety Commissioner, Dr. Hughes, has said that her motto is speak up, listen up, follow up. It may be that for matters within her remit, it could be appropriate to recommend that she be entrusted with the work of following up delivery, perhaps including regular progress reports. Alternative mechanisms include adjourning the inquiry post-publication of the report with a recommendation that the Chair review implementation of accepted recommendations within a given time period, and the possibility of a supplemental report commenting on the success or otherwise of the implementation in the interim. Plus or minus, a recommendation that the implementation of recommendations in the final report be reviewed by the Cross-Party Health and Social Care Committee on a regular basis with consequent reports to Parliament. This appears to be what is happening in relation to follow-up of Cumberledge, and when I'm not pinging her about Women's Hour, I like to ping Miss Richards with entertaining videos of the Select Committee in progress. It's her choice as to which she prefers. Given the work that Dr. Hughes has said she will be doing to follow up redress for those affected by the Cumberledge Review medicines and devices, the Society hopes it may be possible for this inquiry to liaise with her about what, if any, infected blood matters may fall within her remit. Access to current treatment and up-to-date information. The Society endorses paragraph 264 of the UKHCDO closing submissions, and those are about provision of comprehensive care, including a core team of physicians, clinical nurse specialists, psychologists, physiotherapists, lab scientists, and social workers. I'm quoting from their submissions now. And other experts who address disease related to issues and complications, including hepatologists, obstetricians, gynecologists, orthopaedic and dental consultants. Peer review has identified a persistent lack of a full complement of multidisciplinary team members that has gone uncorrected, despite having been identified by previous peer review reports. These deficiencies ultimately arise from inadequate funding of haemophilia centre infrastructure. It would be nice, at a minimum, for your care to be properly funded. The Irish experience. Brian O'Mahony told this inquiry that after compensation, the Health Amendment Act card and knowledgeable, compassionate liaison officers or case managers were the recommendations that have proved most valuable over time as infected people age and their needs change. That experience should inform, we suggest, the package of measures put into place to support the future welfare of infected and affected people. We ask you to make a recommendation that all those infected by blood and blood products and all people with a bleeding disorder have access to information relevant to them about their condition and new treatments to be provided through haemophilia centres, guaranteed access to recombinant. You may be surprised to hear that there are still some rare bleeding disorders where people are reliant on treatment made from human blood and not synthetic treatments. A choice of treatment to suit lifestyle and guaranteed access to new therapies, including gene therapy, guaranteed access to a multidisciplinary care package, including psychological services, pain management and physiotherapy, and equality of access to care, including dental treatment and specifically endoscopies. The Society does not ask for its members or for the community the ability to queue jump. It does ask for a recommendation for a health passport that helps the infected and affected communicate their history and their needs quickly so that they can get the help that they need effectively without having to go through the whole story from start to finish. In its written submissions, the Society asked for recommendations on longer-term assistance, research on future care and palliative care, training and education in apology and memorial. I'm not going to consider those now, but they're of equal importance to the things I am talking about, and we commend those submissions to you. On a separate topic, and I shared this information with Ms Richards and Ms Scolding, King's Counsel, yesterday, the Society has very recently received information about hepatitis C and funeral arrangements. In November last year, it was told about an embalmer who last year refused to touch the body of a man with von Willebrand's disease who was thought to have been infected by blood and had cleared the virus many years before he died last year. I'm very grateful to the research that's done by the Lead A team. They have uncovered relevant 2018 health and safety executive regulations, and it would seem from this 2022 experience that those are not as widely known about as they should be. I am hopeful that Ms Scolding and her solicitors may have more to say about this in due course, and I will leave that issue to them. Turning to public inquiry reform, there's no test for deciding when a public inquiry should be held. Alan Milburn described the current framework as pretty non-existent or woolly. Successive ministers' denial of requests for a public inquiry were based on their acceptance of the line they were given by the civil servants who were supposed to be helping them, that there was no negligence, and that was even when one minister, Caroline Flint, was in receipt of correspondence from the Society that spelt out the fact that patients had been treated without their consent and experimented upon. Further, that patients were given the best treatment available, and anyway, even if they hadn't, all the lessons had been learned. The history of inadequate cooperation with Archer, the defensive, insufficiently objective self-sufficiency report, and the delay in setting up this inquiry are all evidence that a clear and transparent mechanism for making decisions about when to hold a public inquiry or a non-statutory review would be extremely helpful, if not required. The Society suggests a recommendation is made that there be an independent body with the power to convene a public inquiry. That would require an amendment to the Inquiries Act, or a recommendation to the relevant minister that a public inquiry be held. And such an independent body could be charged with applying transparent criteria to assess the circumstances in which inquiries or reviews must be held. And it could collate them so that there's a central repository of recommendations, monitor which recommendations are accepted by government and how the implementation works out, and in appropriate circumstances require inquiry chairs to review such implementation as there's been. The Society also feels that there is a specific need to say something about a requirement that the decision maker meets victims in person. So you've heard evidence from Mr. Burnham and Mr. Jeremy Hunt that both were actively counselled by civil servants against meeting in person those who were campaigning for public inquiries. You'll remember, I think it was Mr. Hunt said he'd been counselled against meeting Nazanin Zaghari Ratcliffe. The Society considers that this sort of a meeting is essential. You've heard at least 3 examples of individuals being profoundly moved and having their views changed by meeting infected and affected people. John Moore, who we've already discussed, in 1987, Mr. Hunt and his interaction with Mr. Doricott and his family, Andy Burnham meeting Eleanor and Fred Bates and realising that something was very wrong. There's no substitute for the decision-maker hearing in person from those who are suffering and seeking justice. There shouldn't be a filtering by civil servants. It submits that however decisions about whether to hold or not hold a public inquiry or statutory review are made in future, an in-person meeting should be a mandatory part of the decision-making process. Candour, redress and consent. These are 3 overlapping concepts which together form a virtuous circle. If you remove any one of them, the circle collapses. Jeremy Hunt and Baroness Cumberledge are advocates for a move from our current adversarial system of negligence, where the burden is on you, the infected or injured person, to prove not only that something went wrong, but that the injury you've suffered was caused by what went wrong. And a switch from that to a no-fault system, or one of redress for avoidable harm caused by systems failure. First Do No Harm considered the 3 medical devices and medicines that we've looked at, and on the face of it, they have no connection to blood. But her observations about candour, patient safety, redress, and the need for a cultural shift in the NHS are highly relevant. She explained in her report that the duty of candour appears not to have had the desired effect of increasing reporting and disclosure, and we draw the inquiry's attention to paragraphs 2.47 to 2.51 of her report. In 2.51, she said this: "We believe that a cultural shift away from blame is needed to create a healthcare system where people are open and honest. We outline how we feel a no-blame, systems-based approach to delivering redress as a substitute for litigation could drive this shift in paragraphs 2.37 to 2.39 and Appendix 3. We believe this shift is essential to deliver a safer NHS where healthcare professionals have no reason to fear being candid and telling the truth to their patients." Her solution was a redress agency, a non-adversarial process with determinations based on avoidable harm, looking at systemic failings. The government rejected that recommendation outright. Its July 2021 response to her report was that those suffering from sodium valproate and pelvic mesh wanting compensation would have to bring legal proceedings. Exactly the same response it gave to you over AIDS in the 1980s and over hepatitis C in the 1990s. One of the reasons it rejected the recommendation was, said the government, that it already has the ability to set up support schemes. And the best example that it could come up with was the, this is how it rephrases it, infected blood support scheme. The only inference that we can draw from the government's reference to that, and we assume that that is a reference to EBS, and this is a reliance in July 2021 on EBS as some sort of model of good practice, is that the government actually thinks that the infected blood support schemes provided or provide an example of redress done well, so that we don't need to change anything. That suggestion flies in the face of all the evidence heard in this inquiry by those of you who utilise the schemes. It suggests that the government doesn't know about or hasn't been listening to the evidence of users given to this inquiry. You've provided abundant evidence of the adverse effect on you of the lack of any financial assessment of your losses and needs, psychological harm caused by different treatment of the infected and affected in the devolved nations, divisive means testing, needless complexity and opacity, applicants making, applications being dealt with and basic errors being made or applicants being disbelieved, onerous requirements for evidence, unexplained exclusion of bereaved parents, the lack of any proper voice of the infected and affected within the administration, and the conflict between users in dire need and administrators who hold back large reserves of monies intended to be paid out. Second, the government's July 2021 response failed to acknowledge or even refer to the oral evidence of Mr. Hancock. He gave evidence to the inquiry on the 21st of May 2021, and he accepted that the trusts and schemes had been run without there being, quote, a proper process around coming to a fair and just way of ensuring that people are supported. So it's surprising that there's no reference to that a couple of months later when the government responded to Cumberledge in July. The government has set up 2 litigation gateways for those harmed by the medicines and devices that Baroness Cumberledge looked at. You can go down the normal route where you instruct your own lawyers and they get on with the business of litigating. Alternatively, you can ask the government to investigate, and this is what happens. The government's solicitors will provide the government with a report. The government will look at its own report and it will either admit liability and pay compensation to you, or it will deny liability. Either way, the government will not release its report to you. And you can see these gateways set out on a web page, resolution.nhs.uk/vaginal-mesh. That approach is consistent with an adversarial system in which each side can claim privilege and withhold the expert advice it's received. It's a legal process geared towards establishing blame, not an open and transparent, patient safety-driven process aimed at establishing the harm that's been caused, how it could be avoided, and what needs to change. And you have to wonder, where the report obtained by government through its alternative litigation gateway tells the government that it needs to admit liability and pay compensation, why should not the person who has been harmed by its negligence see that report? One answer could be a concern by government that that individual might then share that report with other injured patients. So this is not a system for learning, it's a system for being defensive. There are signs that the government may be having a change of heart. In this Woman's Hour interview on the 3rd of January, Dr. Hughes told the BBC that the Health Minister has asked her to look into redress for the Cumberledge victims, if I call them that, and Dr. Hughes is looking for a commitment from the government that it will provide that redress. One didn't get the impression that she'd had the answer she was looking for at that stage. But these patients shouldn't have to fight the NHS and the government any more than you should have to. A fair, predictable, swiftly responsible system for redress is an idea whose time has come. And a further advantage is that it could be a centre of excellence for financial redress frameworks. The delay that you are enduring while the cross-party working group responds to Sir Robert's detailed scheme could be minimised for others in future, because there would be well-run schemes that could be adapted quickly to suit the needs of different groups of people avoidably injured by systems failures. Consent. Cumberledge Review's findings demonstrate that there's still quite a lot going wrong. Doctors are too ready still to make assumptions about what patients want. or adopt the position that they know what is in their patients' best interests. They're still overselling benefits, underselling burdens, and not being clear enough about that which is uncertain and that which is unknown. They're particularly bad about giving balanced advice about medical products where there's no consensus about the risks, and therefore no consensus about how you should weigh up the benefits and burdens. The Society notes, for example, paragraph 5.41 of First Do No Harm. That records that as late as 2014, the MHRA was maintaining in a report it produced at the request of the Chief Medical Officer that the benefits of mesh outweighed the risks. The Cumberledge Review found that that stance did not fully reflect an understanding of all the risks, and it affirmed the evidence of one campaigner that, quote, the real-world evidence and patient stories of harms have been overlooked. The Society invites you, sir, to consider the informed consent section of the government's response to that review and consider whether its actions for improvement go far enough. Publication of this inquiry's report might also provide an opportunity to recommend ongoing monitoring of implementation of, for example, the National Institute for Health and Care Excellence Shared Decision-Making Guideline, and importantly, the extent to which patients are routinely made aware that they have the right to record a discussion with a doctor if they wish to do so, and the extent to which patients are taking up that opportunity and measure the effect. A study on those matters could be beneficial. The civil service. A few words about the civil service, which has not been an ally to those harmed by infected blood in your search for truth. We'd like to say an extended bit, if we might, about the government's 2006 self-sufficiency report. The Society has been dismayed to read the statement of Peter Bergin, the author of the government self-sufficiency report, the original author, I should say, and his statement is dated the 15th of December 2022. Since it was made available the day before written submissions were due to be filed, it wasn't a matter that we were able to deal with in written submissions. This is the story. He completed his report and delivered the final draft on Christmas Eve 2002. He says in his statement that in preparation for his report, he had a meeting with the Society, and he describes that as having been extremely helpful. After he delivered his report, the Department of Health paid some consultants, we don't know who or very much about them, to amend the report. The amended draft was sent to clinicians and others, again, we're not sure who, for their comments prior to publication. It was not sent to the Society prior to publication. The department published the report, which it had amended, without telling Mr. Bergin, and Mr. Bergin only found out that the report, the original version of which he drafted in 2002, had been published in 2018. If you look at his witness statement, which I recommend, WITN 7485001, he provides a table with a comparison of what he wrote in 2002 and the amended document was published in 2006. And that effectively shows that his report was, to use the modern expression, sexed up by the consultants employed by the government. The references to the Society appealing to government not to ban imports of American imported product despite allegedly knowing of the risk of NA and B hepatitis were added without his knowledge. So far as the Society can see, it could be wrong, but we don't think so, Mr. Bergin's statement to this inquiry is the first time that the then Professor Frank Hill is identified as a contributor to his work. There are footnotes referring to Mr. Bergin's interview with Chris Hodgson and his interview with Dr. Mark Winter, and there is a reference to reports from Dr. Hill, but no mention of an interview with him. We assume, but we don't know, that when Mr. Bergin approached Dr. Hill to assist with the self-sufficiency report, Dr. Hill did not disclose to him the fact that a negligence claim brought on behalf of one of his child patients whom he had infected with HIV through contraindicated prescription of Factorate rather than cryoprecipitate had been settled at trial in 1992. Had the published self-sufficiency report included a list of contributors, the Buggins family, and perhaps the Society, would have had additional grounds to challenge it. Had Dr. Hill learned any lessons from the case brought against him, and had he been open and honest with Mr. Bergin would have been given direct evidence that at least one cohort of child patients may not have been given the best treatment available at the time. But instead, it was possible for Professor Hill to cover up his wrongdoing and mislead the original author of the government's own internal review, and I say again, an internal review that it did not share with the Society in draft before publishing it. Importantly, we also see history repeating itself. It's through the good offices of Elizabeth Buggins that it was drawn to my attention why it is likely that Mr. Bergin went to Professor Hill. We don't know, and so it may be that you wish to ask Mr. Bergin, I don't know. Mr. Kennedy, King's Counsel, has been kind enough to confirm the facts for me. But in 2002, Professor Hill, as he then was the chair of the UKH CDO. So it seems likely that he was interviewed in his capacity as the head of that organisation. One sees alarming parallels with what happened with Professor Bloom, who, as a result of being perhaps the chair of the UKH CDO, was then asked to sit on almost every other committee and had a finger in almost every other blood products pie. And we see the damage that that over-reliance on one single individual caused. It's a pity that there wasn't a wider breadth of interviewees, perhaps. It's no fault of Mr. Bergin's. He did the best that he could in the circumstances and was not to know otherwise. The whole history of that report, its amendment, its publication without any consultation with those who'd contributed to it, and an opportunity to comment or correct inaccuracies, is a good illustration of what can happen when there is no enforceable duty on civil servants to behave with candour, openness and transparency. There's no incentive for patient groups to assist government with report writing if this sort of process is considered appropriate. And worse, patient advocacy charities would be wise to distrust government or civil servants and not engage. Outside the NHS and the Care Quality Commission regulated care facilities, there's no mechanism for enforcement of ethical standards in public service. Lord Evans explained to the inquiry on the 9th of November last year that the 7 principles are not themselves enforceable in a compliance sense, but they give a very clear steer as to the way that individual public servants of any sort should be behaving. And against that background, accountability is pretty meaningless unless you have openness of information, because you can't call somebody to account if the facts are not known. Well, quite. Without information, there's no consent, no accountability, and no redress. So the Society, having read Mr. Bergin's witness statement, makes the following additional recommendations, in addition to the introduction of a formal duty of candour for civil servants. That all government reports should bear the name of the author. That where individuals have contributed, there should be a list of contributors. And that all contributors should be able to see a report in draft before it's published and given the opportunity to correct inaccuracies. So I move now to my conclusion. After you your report is published, if not before, there will be further work to do. All of the contaminated blood, infected and affected, must get every penny of compensation to which they're entitled, the support they need to obtain it, quick and smooth access to the treatment and psychological support needed in future. No one should feel alone or traumatised by the process or unable to cope with more administrative burdens. And the Society will be there for every person within the bleeding disorder community who feels it could help them. Addressing the devastating impact of the scandal and campaigning for improvements for everyone in the community has been a central part of the Society's work for the last 40 years. It fully expects that work to continue for the foreseeable future and after what will be a landmark report. This vital inquiry has opened up conversations within families about what happened, and that's been welcome. But it's also created the need for even more support. For some, the relief of being able to speak truthfully about the past has been a healing process. But for others, and particularly younger generations perhaps, who may have a bleeding disorder themselves, discovering that their family history has been based on half-truths and omissions has been difficult to come to terms with. Some people thought they had put a dark and painful time in their life behind them and are now revisiting the past and finding that it remains traumatic. Others didn't realise the extent to which their consultant had withheld information from them and are only now learning about that and beginning to process such a grave breach of trust. The Society will always be a safe place for anyone in the community impacted by this scandal, a charity that people of any age, gender and race can turn to, confident of a knowledgeable, empathetic response, practical help where possible, and informed, robust advocacy if the support they need is still lacking. My last words are again from the Bishop Jones report. He said this: people talk too loosely about closure. They fail to recognise that there can be no closure to love, and nor should there be for someone you have loved and lost. Furthermore, grief is a journey without a destination. The bereaved travel through a landscape of memories and thoughts of what might have been. It is a journey marked by milestones. Some you seek, some you stumble on. For the families and survivors of Hillsborough, these milestones have included the search for truth, accountability, and justice. But even these are not the end of the road. They are still travelling, and this report is another step along the way. Thank you very much, all of you, and thank you, Sir Brian.
Thank you, Ms. Gollop. We meet again then at 2 o'clock to hear from the UKHCDO. 2 o'clock.